Welcome back to the My Latin Life podcast. Since 2014, My Latin Life has been your trusted guide to traveling and living in Latin America. My guest today is BowTiedOdin, and we're going to be talking all about language learning, strategies for language acquisition, learning multiple languages. You have some good tweets, my friend. I resonate with a lot of what you say, so we're going to crack into that in this episode. How's it going, man?
Doing well. Thank you for having me on. Yeah, I'm really excited to talk about it. I think that I have a rather unique approach to learning a new language, and with what you do, I think it could be mutually beneficial for a lot of the audience crossover.
Yeah, definitely. Um, I know this might be a tall task to start the episode, but people are here to learn about language learning, I guess. And I thought maybe to kick things off, tall task, but to give us your whole philosophy on language learning. You probably have some kind of outline or grand master idea type of thing. Can we kick it off with that?
Yeah, absolutely. I've gotten better at speaking about this. I write about it a lot, but there are three main components. The first one that I like to focus on is basically called, I call it language recovery. Especially in the US, you have millions of people who sat 2, 3, 4 years in a Spanish class and then walked away from it, never looked at it again, and now they say gracias to the waiter once every other week when they go out for Mexican food. My philosophy is that you never have to start from zero because everything that you learned in those classes is still there. It's just dormant because you don't need it. You haven't told your brain that you needed it. So when you actually sit down and write out the things you remember, read a little bit in Spanish, listen to some Spanish, a lot of it comes rushing back. And then from there, you already have some momentum built up. And I'm all about momentum because it can be
Hmm.
easy to not want to study a language, especially when you had a bad day speaking and people were making fun of you, or you were probably your own harshest critic in any moment. Starting from an established base is always easier than starting from zero. From there, I think it's pretty undisputed that immersion language learning is the best way to approach it. So I like to do what I call localized immersion. So just surrounding yourself with the language as much as possible. Anything that you would do in your native language, do it in the language you're learning. So if you would normally read the news in your native language, find a news site and read it in your target language. If you would normally watch
Hmm.
sports in English, watch them in Spanish, things like that.
Hmm.
And really just replacing one thing every day can build more momentum. Uh, and then from there, it's all about getting into the patterns, especially if you're focusing on Romance languages or Germanic languages or Slavic languages. There's going to be a lot of overlap and things that you can use from one language to the next to really set yourself up for success.
Is that what you
And
mean by patterns? Like
yeah,
the
yeah,
commonalities or the what do you call it, the mutual intelligibility or what's the word, lexicon between
yeah, shared
languages?
lexicon, shared
Uh-huh.
characteristics, and a lot of it because especially if you're coming from a base of English, if you speak English natively, a lot of what you know is actually a Latin base. So if you're learning Spanish, you can use that to progress in that language. It just may require a deeper knowledge of English.
Okay, keep going. Keep hitting me with philosophy.
So that's the three parts of the philosophy. I also don't think that anybody should not speak the language just because they can't speak it perfectly. One of the funniest parts of learning a language is that first 2, 3, 4 months when you're having to make do with the words that you have. So instead of calling a pot lid the pot lid, you call it its hat, right? And
Uh-huh.
instead of um, calling a glove in German, it's handschuh, right? So you're making do with what you a German
Those are the
might tell
hardest
you,
words, man.
where
Those
are
are
my
very
hand shoes?
those
You're
are those
like,
are definitely like the hardest words, like screw, nut, bolt, uh like all these like little things in the kitchen. Yeah, those are tough.
yeah. And you're just like, wait, I don't understand how these things go together. um, I also think it's funny, especially in the U.S., to learn a language from like a menu. When you find out like chili relleno is a refilled rellenar chili, right? So it's things like that, especially as an American, where you're surrounded by language all the time, just paying attention to it and seeing how it relates back to English or to other things you know. The more points of reference you have, the easier it's going to be for you to make sure that those words, phrases stay inside your mind for the long term rather than, searching what it means on Google Translate and forgetting it 10 seconds later.
And just to run through the three pillars of your philosophy one more time, like in one sentence each, could you do that?
Yeah, absolutely. So, language recovery, never start from zero. You know more than you think.
Uh huh.
Pattern recognition, tie things together so that you have multiple points of reference. And localized immersion, surround yourself with the language as much as possible in your given everyday life.
Okay. One and two are pretty similar, right? Because it's basically like, let's just say it's your first foreign language and you're just working with English to start, and you know that, simply becomes simplemente, right? So that's kind of what you're saying. But doesn't that hit upon both points one and two of your philosophy?
Yeah, and they overlap, and I hope that they would overlap in that scenario because it makes it easier to add in that second layer where simplemente. Anytime you add mente, you're adding an ly to an English word, which
Uh
makes it
huh.
an adverb. Um, think things like that are exactly what I'm talking about. I should have emailed you this document before we started, but
It's all
it's
right. I like the uh, zero prep option.
well, I've got it up. I should have just sent it to you. But the other thing that I think people ignore because it's something that gets a laugh is stereotypes. So you hear a lot the stereotype that if you want to say something in Spanish, you just add an O to an English word, right? And yeah, it's kind of funny, but it also works a lot. You have like excepto, minuto, plato, caso, caro, secreto, acento, perfecto, all of those things. You just added an O to an English word.
Hmm. Yeah, there's
So
like,
it's worth paying
what,
attention
what
to
what
things.
do you know what percentage shared lexicon Spanish and English have? It's probably like 35% something.
I'm not entirely sure, but I'd assume it's in the 30s.
Yeah,
Um,
it can be looked up for sure.
the Latin base, uh, and it's the same. I don't know if you know how many Romance languages you know, but any English word that ends with like a tion or sion is going to be the same word in a Romance language.
Hmm.
Fiction,
Okay.
action, information, and it's the same in French. Information, action, négation, all those things.
This is true. I mean, they come to English from French directly because the English crown used to speak French, the Normans, like 1,000 years ago. Learning French,
Yeah,
you really learn a lot about the English language. Like, it's kind of crazy.
big time. I got in a little bit of trouble for this. I don't know why I'm search banned, but this is like the hottest take I've ever had. Um, was that the people don't know how many of their words that they use are from another language. And so when they use an accent with a word, I get really frustrated if they don't use it with every single word in that language. So, for example, if you were to say it has a certain je ne sais quoi, then you should also be saying encore or rendezvous because those are French words. They're not English words.
Yep, this is true. Yeah, I do have a lot of thoughts on this because this is how I approach language learning as well, where you basically you can sort of target the next easiest language of attack is going to be the one that's the most similar to the languages that you already speak, right? And so once you've learned the Romance languages, let's say you start with Spanish or French, If you start with Spanish, move on to Portuguese. If you start with French, you could move on to Spanish or Italian, or really anywhere kind of in the Romance realm. And then Russian has a certain level of lexicon, overlapping lexicon with English and Latin languages, like maybe 20% ish, something like that. Arabic has some overlapping lexicon as well. And I used to read these like Wikipedia pages about the languages where you see like the origin and you see like, oh, these are Germanic languages and these are Slavic languages and these are, and you kind of see how the roots go back and you're like, okay, like where did Greek come from and where did Hebrew come from and all this type of stuff. And then you can sort of like base it in language families. And I think it's important. I think a lot of people don't realize these things. I mean, I think I have a pretty smart audience that probably knows that, for example, English is a Germanic language, but not everyone does.
Yeah, breaking that down has been interesting because I mean you know it because you've been on the internet doing this since 2014, but you have to write at different levels for different audiences. So for Twitter, I can approach things a little bit more in depth than like a TikTok short. It's like it's not really worth time to explain to the TikTok audience what etymology is. But on Twitter, you can kind of really get into it, and then people see it because they're reading all the time instead of just watching. Because when you're watching and hearing things, it's not the same input as seeing it and being like, "Oh yeah, that looks like that." They probably are
Mhm.
connected.
So, if I had to summarize your philosophy just one more time, it's basically like build on what you know using the lexical similarity. Um, Realize that language learning is largely an act of memory and sort of um, review the stuff you learn and find ways to kind of memorize it or and write it down and this kind of thing. And then speak from day one is what Benny Lewis would say, which I think kind of hits on your point three, which is like don't be afraid to start speaking. And I was always told that third point as speak from day one. Benny Lewis, you probably obviously know who he is,
Yeah,
fluentin3months.com. And he was like one of the early guys that was like talking about language learning, kind of starting around the Tim Ferriss era. And yeah, his that was really inspiring for me for sure.
yeah. The speak from day one thing is really big, and I don't quite understand why people would be afraid to do it. And it's not because it's not scary to like make mistakes in front of other people, but on day one you're making mistakes in front of yourself. You're not really talking to anybody else. So if you're too afraid to make mistakes in front of yourself, chances are that when you do get the chance to speak to somebody, you're probably not going to. And I think that we all share the idea that you're going to play how you practice, so you better practice hard. uh, and that's why I like things like one of my big things is reading aloud and writing because I
Mm,
think focusing on learning how to think in the language is the best way to get you over that hump of I can't speak. Okay, yes, I can. Um, and when you're writing and when you're speaking, those are the only two times you're really thinking in the language. So
mm-hmm.
the best way to speak without having to come up with it, translate it, is just read out loud
Yep.
because you're not thinking about the words anymore. You're just reading what's already there, and you can start with 3 words and then 5 words and then one sentence and then 3 sentences until you can read a full paragraph out loud and fluidly.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and that again is a moment when you're not going to get judged for your mistakes because you're making them in front of yourself, but you're still speaking from day one. And I think that's probably what we all kind of agree is a good start, but it's definitely
Mm-hmm.
something that's big for me. And then using that same thought process, now write your own thing because it's your thoughts, and then say that aloud. Because what happens is you've probably noticed written language and spoken language are very different things. The formality necessary, the grammar tenses that you have to use, they change from writing to speaking. So if you write something and you say it out loud, there's a high chance that you sit back and think, okay, that's wrong. Why is it wrong? And then you can kind of investigate that. And teaching yourself to self critique in a productive way can make a big difference in learning really anything. But a language is a big part of that.
Yeah, definitely. We had on a previous podcast episode, Mikel, who you probably have seen on Twitter before as
Yeah,
well. I forget his like title or whatever he goes as, like his like sub name or whatever. But you guys know Mikel. He's been on the podcast. He's on Twitter, and he was saying a lot about how reading out loud is one of the best things that you can do. And it's honestly something I never really did much of, and I started doing a little bit before bedtime, where I'll read. It's bedtime. I sound like a child, but before uh, where you like read, like I'll read out loud, and whoo, that'll put you to sleep. You know what I mean? If you want to sleep well, start reading out loud in a foreign language, and you'll be like, you know what? I'd rather go to bed. Screw this. You know what I mean?
Oh yeah. I'm teaching my wife French right now. Uh, she did 6 years in school, and they taught her two of the 27 verb tenses, which is crazy. Over 6 years to learn two. She paid for 4 of those years in college.
To be fair, you
Um,
only need like two or three, but
yeah, when speaking, but now I'm making her read.
reading is tough. Reading is tough because you if you read like Wikipedia in French, they're using tenses that you don't even see like off of Wikipedia. Like the word like fut, like
Yep.
FUT, you don't see that any,
Yeah.
even in the newspaper, but I digress. Yeah. So what languages do you speak?
French, Spanish. I've got weak German, and English, and then I know sign language, but that's from a past life.
Hey guys, quick break from the podcast to tell you about job stacking. If you're a remote or hybrid worker looking to maximize your earning potential, then Rolf Haltza, author of Job Stacking, guarantees you'll be able to double your income by implementing his paycheck multiplication layering method. This is the exact system Rolf has used to take his own income and those of many others beyond 20K a month. With this method, Rolf contractually guarantees that you'll be able to double your income in 45 days. So, if you're interested in unleashing your earning potential and doubling your income, then click the link in the description and book a call with Rolf right now. So, how did you learn French? Have you been to Quebec? Have you been to France?
I lived in Belgium, and that's actually where I developed a lot of these techniques that I talk about. My host sister used to have me read out loud to her because she didn't speak English, and that was horrible, but it worked so well. So yeah, I was a Rotary Exchange student in Belgium, and the year before that I lived in Costa Rica, studied at the University of Costa Rica in San Jose
Nice.
for 3 months. After that, I moved to Germany for 2 months before moving back to Belgium for a year, and I did a translation job out there for a German family, but they wanted me to speak French because they didn't. So that's where the French came in.
Okay, we're gonna put you to the test. My French is pretty bad these days, but we're gonna put you to the test. Um, um, c'est quoi ta partie favorite de la Belgique?
Um, Ce que j'aimais le plus, c'était soit la bière, soit les gens, parce que c'est un des pays plus agréables en Europe. Et j'adore les frites. Ce que je dis, les frites belges, pas les frites françaises.
Uh-huh.
Euh, mais on avait 12 bars à côté de mon école quand j'étais là.
12 bars,
Et
c'est beaucoup de bars.
ouais, il y avait plein. Et c'était juste à côté de mon école. Et il y a un jour qui s'appelle jour de Jupiler. Et le Jupiler, c'est
Jupiler. Je sais pas c'est
Jupiler.
quoi.
C'est la bière le plus fameuse de Belgique.
Ah, ok.
Et donc, si tu vois l'équipe nationale de foot, c'est ils ont le même euh,
Couleur.
couleur, le même symbole.
Uh-huh.
Et donc, il y a un jour qui s'appelle le jour de jubilaire. Et pendant ce jour, chaque bar va te donner une bière gratuite.
Nice. Free
Et
beer.
vu, et vu qu'il y avait 12, j'étais pété en retournant aux classes.
Donc, pour chaque goal, une bière gratis.
Non, chaque jour, seulement 7 jours,
Ah, okay, okay.
il y avait chaque bar qui donnait une bière gratuite.
Anyway, I kind of lost, but yeah, no, I got it. I got it. So I would say your French is quite good, like very, very, very good, especially for you're American, right?
Yes, yeah.
So especially for someone that really learned very little. Obviously, I learned a little bit more in Canada, but you're like starting from a lower base. Yeah, yours is like pretty damn good, and I'm sure you're rusty, but that
Thank you.
was, but you're quite good. Yeah.
Yeah, I actually went to school after I got back from my exchange year for French translation. Um, and it's interesting. I don't know how the Canadian university system works, but the way that the US university system works, it's a credit system. And so you can get credits by taking tests. One of them, which is something that I talk about on my page, is the CLEP exam. So you can CLEP out, test out of 12 credits, which is the equivalent of $3,600, depending on where you're going, but that's like the average of Spanish. And then you don't even have to take Spanish in college if you don't want to, or a foreign language at all. And I tested out 38 French credits.
Okay. Cool. Now let's test your Spanish. Putting you on the spot.
Okay, this
Vamos
is
a testear, examinar tu español. Entonces, ¿estudiaste solo en Costa Rica o también en otros países?
es que viví en Arizona cuando
Ujú.
era joven y hay muchos mexicanos. La mayoría de mi equipo de fútbol eran
Hablan
mexicanos.
español.
Eso es.
¿En la
Entonces,
cancha?
sí. Entonces, c'est très, le, pro- le problème, c'est que mezclo los idiomas y a veces no sé même quelle langue je pense.
Yeah, me too. I mix them too.
That's my biggest problem. Teaching French and then speaking Spanish is like, holy crap.
So you teach French.
Yeah, I work on preply.com. I
Okay.
teach French, Spanish, and English. I've got several, mostly English as a second language students, and then 4 or 5 French students.
Nice. That's very cool. So there you go. You got to get Portuguese next, man.
So I was talking to Bowtie Grandma about this because I can read it and I can understand a large part of it, especially if it's Brazilian Portuguese, because it's a little
Hmm.
bit more Spanish. Portuguese sounds to me like a Russian speaking Spanish, um, but they make weird noises with their mouth, man.
They do. It's very nasally. But I think French kind of preps people for Portuguese because they're both very nasally and they're kind of like the only two nasally languages. And I think it works well for me because I have a sort of a nasally Canadian voice. Uh,
That's
but there, I think French and Portuguese actually have quite a lot in common, particularly Quebecois French and Brazilian Portuguese.
Quebecois French is a whole different game, man. It can be hard to understand some of the Quebecois.
It's hard, and the hard part is that you basically need to learn everything about normal French, including slang from France, and then you have to layer on this whole additional mini language, which is Quebecois French. So learning Canadian French is actually in a way more difficult than learning French in France. Because if you learn French in France, you only have to deal with like standard French. You know, you'll hear like African accents and stuff like that, but you really only have to deal with like one variety of French. But if you learn in Quebec, you really have to learn both varieties. So it's an increased workload, but um, it's cool. I like it. Like
It's
I'm pretty familiar with it. And the thing is, it's hard to find. it's hard to find stuff because like it's hard to find like resources. But there's enough movies out there and stuff. So
That's the other thing. I love watching movies in other languages. I don't know if you've watched Lupin, but that's how my wife got
Lupin, yeah,
inspired.
I've watched, yep.
Oh, so good. So she got inspired to learn French from that. So we bought the books. I've got the full five collection of Arsène Lupin.
Yeah, that's a good one. Yeah, I like Omar Sy, the guy there. Okay,
Oh,
I guess let's keep talking about, things that the audience can do in order to learn languages or, what are some of the big things that you talk about on Twitter, um, like the big themes and where do you think people respond the most in terms of like where they feel that emotional connection to the idea of language learning and some of the epiphanies that you share?
one of the things I think is important to keep in mind is the why of learning a language. And I kind of agree with a lot of what Bull says in regards to, what you're going to choose for Wi-Fi money when it comes to learning a language. You should not be focused on the language you're passionate about, in my personal opinion.
Should
It
not.
should not,
Okay.
because passion's not enough. When it really sucks and you just don't want to do it, it's a lot easier to push through that if you have proximity to the language where people are speaking it around you. If you have heritage to the language where your grandfather, your great grandfather, or grandmother spoke it, where you have a need for it. So if you use it at work or at school, those are all better reasons than I'm passionate about it because they're
Practicality,
all
basically.
exactly, they're all more pragmatic.
Yeah, well, I think passion's definitely a good thing. And enthusiasm, I really think people should follow their enthusiasm and their energy. But yeah, I guess if there's no practical way to use it, you can only get so far. I think there's kind of like a middle point there, which is that intellectually, it's very easy to say, like, yeah, learning Chinese would be great, learning Russian would be great, but it's the chasm is between here and there is like absolutely enormous. And yeah, so to that extent, maybe practicality has to come into the picture.
Well, I think part of it too is, and I'm not meaning to dismiss enthusiasm or passion. I think the better you get at it, the more passionate you're going to be about it. And I think you're going to get better at it if you're learning it for practical reasons because you kind of have to. French was never like my first choice of a language. I just got sent to Belgium. I didn't even know they spoke French in Belgium. I thought, okay, I'm going to learn Dutch or I'm going to learn German, and because they speak all three. And I just landed in the French part. But now that I'm good at it, I really enjoy it. And I'm enthusiastic about coming back to read in French or listen to things in French or watch things in French. So I think if you can get over the initial, oh, I'm not really passionate about it, but it's good for me, you can get to the, wow, now I'm passionate about this because I put in the hard work and I'm good at it.
Hmm. What are some other epiphanies or things that people really respond well to on Twitter?
People really enjoy learning a language when it doesn't feel like it. So
Yes.
that's why for example, there's several different approaches, but just for an easy example, I got gifted Helldivers 2 for my birthday.
What's that?
It's a new game that's like,
Video game?
yeah, yeah, and
Okay.
it's four player online. You go in and you serve democracy to the bugs. It's very Star Troopers esque, dude.
And
It's
so you set the
hilarious.
game in a foreign language.
Set the game in a foreign language. Put a VPN on to be in a country where they speak the language you're trying to learn. Um,
Mm.
join designated foreign game services. All of the Germans I know who speak the best English play League of Legends and speak English to talk shit. And they're just fantastic at English. Well, all the other ones who learned in school are afraid to talk to you.
Mm.
So I think video games can be a huge crutch and they can be a net negative. But if you're gonna play them in a language, especially if it's a game you've already played. Play it in your language you're trying to learn. If you've got a PC, you can change language on Steam to like 30 languages. Why not
Yeah.
do that?
And is it important to do the VPN to get localized because it puts you in like local chat rooms to that country?
Yeah, unless you have like Discord servers or something else that you're a part of where you can get into it, the VPN's going to make a big difference.
Makes sense. I noticed that in that vein, when you set your device settings to a language, it's actually it's like a domino effect because when you set your device, like let's just say you set your phone to Spanish, it also changes your Google results. It changes the apps on your phone. It's not like you change your device to Spanish, but the apps are still in English somehow. No, like it changes all your apps. It changes your Google results. And literally, like different websites will show up because they think you're a Spanish speaker, right? Um, and so it's more than just changing the device settings. It actually like changes a lot of aspects of the user experience.
Yeah, I think changing your phone is a huge step forward. And one of the things that people don't think about when they do this is one, that everything's going to be in that language now. But two, if you really don't have anyone to practice with, or if you're really afraid of making mistakes in front of somebody else, your dictation is now in that language. So talk to the phone, and if it can understand and write out what you're trying to say properly, then you know you've said it correctly. Or if it's struggling, which talk to text often does, even if you say something perfectly, then you know where you need to work, and maybe the ending of this word didn't flow properly into the start of the next word, and you can kind of focus on that specifically. But the talk to text is a great tool for people who really are afraid to make mistakes.
Hey guys, quick break from the episode to tell you about BitRefill. BitRefill allows you to shop online and in person without banks, converting your crypto directly into merchant balance. We're talking gift cards to Nike, Amazon, Apple, Airbnb, Hotels.com, and many more, all paid for with crypto. BitRefill offers more than 10,000 gift card options in 180 countries all across Latin America, including Brazil, Colombia, Mexico, Argentina, El Salvador, and many more. You can also apply the code MyLatinLife at checkout to get 10% back on your first purchase. Go to bitrefill.com for more information. You know, I was messing around with ChatGPT the other day, and it can do translations on the fly in like a fun way where you can say like, "Hey, tell the cab driver I'll only pay a maximum of $5." Tell him in Spanish, and it'll be like, "Yo solo puedo pagar $5." So you can do stuff like that. And so I was playing around with it with my girlfriend, and I was like, "ChatGPT, tell my girlfriend to stop being mean to me." And it's like, disculpe, no podemos, es que no podemos hablar malo de otras personas. And it actually kind of goes woke on you. And
Oh my.
so, like, if you try to say, like, hey, can you, like, say something, like, racist or whatever to my girlfriend, it'll be like, disculpe, no podemos decir cosas racistas. Or, like, you know what I mean? Like, shit like that. So it's kind of funny. But that's definitely something you could do is there's a lot to do on the. You know, the way I've put it to other friends who are trying to learn languages is just like go about your day as if you were already that person that spoke that language. So if you were a Spanish person, obviously your device would be in Spanish. Obviously your computer would be in Spanish. Obviously you would it would change impact things about your days, maybe where you go or how you talk to the bus driver. I have no idea, you know what I mean? So, or the type of websites that you would read. Obviously if you were Spanish, you would read the newspaper in Spanish, this type of thing. So maybe people can like say like, what would Spanish speaking me do in this situation, type of thing.
Yeah, and that is actually why I started. One of the newsletters that I have is a Spanish resource newsletter, and I try to just cover different topics with video and written resources. And one of my favorite ones, I was actually watching it before we spoke because I knew you were going to speak to me in Spanish. I was like, I got to get French out of my head. um, and it's a little YouTube channel called De Mi Rancho a Tu Cocina, and it's this sweet old lady who just makes the best looking food, and she just describes it as she's doing it, tells you what she's doing. So you're
Hmm.
learning how to cook in Spanish. And I think learning a new thing in the language is awesome. So learning how to cook in Spanish, learning how to code, I've got a coding one in Spanish, learning about
Hmm.
astronomy in whatever you're interested in, right? Like that's my whole thing. Do the things you're interested in your target language because
Yeah,
it makes it
exactly.
more
Learn
enjoyable.
chess in Spanish,
Yeah.
definitely. And then another next level is if you want to maintain a second language and you want to learn a third language, learn that language in learn the third language in your second language. So if you were learning Portuguese in Spanish, there's resources out there for that. You would
Yeah.
just type in like aprender el portugués, and there would be all these resources on YouTube and so forth of like Spanish guys speaking Portuguese, and then they speak like half and half. And so that way you maintain the old language, or maintain your first foreign language as you learn your second foreign language.
It's funny you mentioned that. When I did move to Belgium, they wouldn't let me take English class because it was going to be too easy. So they put me in Spanish class, and I had already been to Costa Rica, so I was learning French in Spanish. And I don't know if I've ever been that tired in my life, but it works. It's just exhausting.
Yeah, definitely makes sense. Hit us with more tips and discussions you've had on Twitter.
Um, One of the, I think, biggest problems in the US particularly is that the way a second language is approached in our schools is so atrocious that people think it sucks to learn a new
Hmm.
language, and that really bums me out because I think it's one of the best things, one of the most enjoyable things to learn because it just gives you so many more things you can do, so many more people to talk to, places to visit. um, and there's this weird sentiment that English is all you really need. And yeah, you can get by. But we were in Spain for our honeymoon, and in the central train station of Madrid, there was not one person who could speak English there, at least not who worked there. And so,
Hmm.
you think, oh, I'll go to a big city, they'll speak English to me there. Unless you're in Germany, not really, especially not in France, Spain. They might speak English, but they're not going to speak it to you unless you're trying to buy something.
Right.
Uh, so that's one of the frustrations that I run into a lot is English is good enough, and I really hated my Spanish teacher 10 years ago, so I don't want to learn Spanish now. It's like, well, we have different approaches.
You post a lot of memes, like language learning memes.
Okay, so that started from one of my German buddies. The way he was teaching me German, he's just sending me a meme probably every hour. Um, it was a lot, but I learned to read that way. I was like, oh, this sentence makes sense. And then I think learning a language through comedy is really cool because once you laugh, you know you get it. And if you can tell jokes, even if it's a one-off uh, in the language you're learning, that's a really way to break walls and make friends. Uh, so between knowing memes, and it's also a window into culture, you can learn a lot about American culture by the memes that go around, and you
Hmm.
can learn a lot about any culture by the memes that go around. So this is particularly important when it comes to Spanish. If you're learning Spanish to go to Mexico, it's going to look very different than if you're learning Spanish to go to Spain. As that's going to look very different than if you're learning Spanish to go to Chile. So if you ideally can find a group or a website that has memes or jokes from that particular country or region of the world, you're going to get a better window into the culture, and being able to speak about the culture, even if you don't completely understand it, is going to make integration insofar as making friends and being welcome, being established wherever you move to or go to visit, much more easy, much easier.
I think making it easy and not seem like work is probably one of the most important things that people can do. to be completely honest, because people just avoid work, generally speaking. And the more that you can make it not seem like work by just watching movies or listening to music and this kind of thing, I think that's huge. Just like removing the barrier to entry. No, almost no one that learns a language is like actually picking up grammar books and stuff and doing exercises.
I have a thing against grammar books because of how languages are taught in the US. I don't know how it is in Canada, but in the US, you'll lose. So let's say you have a 10-point quiz, you'll lose 1 point for getting the wrong article. And I think that's just horrendous because who cares if you use the wrong article? The is the. I mean, when you're speaking French, do you hear le or la or do you hear ol? It you don't really.
I think like masculine and feminine is important. I think like don't think you can ogre it and just like use either one and it doesn't matter. Maybe to some extent it doesn't matter, but it kind of depends what stage you're at. I think at some point, I think like what Benny Lewis used to say would be like in the beginning, first couple months, don't worry about grammar. Just focus on speaking, getting some sentences down, getting comfortable, and just speak and don't be afraid. And then go back and tighten up the grammar later.
Yeah, same approach for me. Like for your first 3 months, it does not matter what the you use when you're speaking. It's going to be so fast that no one's going to notice. And even if they do notice, if you're having an actual conversation, they're going to forget by the time it's their turn to speak. But more importantly, like you said, it gives you an opportunity to refine something that already exists. You can't refine something that doesn't exist. But if you have the skills, you can refine them and make them sharper.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Uh, One other not so hot take that I have is that Duolingo is ass. I don't know if you've seen their marketing recently, but it's so bad. And
I paid for Duolingo for a year because I used it for a long time, and at one point there's just so many friggin' pop-ups that I was like, you know what? Maybe if I pay for a year, it'll get rid of the pop-ups. And I bought the family plan. I invited my, like 4 people on it, and it was like okay, it was a little bit better, but there's still so many pop-ups that I think if they just got rid of the pop-ups, it'd be fine because it'd be like Emerald Club, you got a ruby, and all this stuff. I'm like X X X, and like it was just so annoying, and so that was really the reason I dropped it. Other than the fact that like the phrases aren't that useful, it'll be like yo quiero manzana or whatever, but
yeah,
even beyond for me it was the friggin' pop-ups more than the anything else. But yeah, that's my rant.
I paid for it for a year too because you're right. You finish a lesson and then you have a 60-second ad, and then you finish another lesson, you have a 60-second ad. I'm like, my time is worth way more than this. That's crazy.
Exactly, and I thought paying for it would get rid of them, but they still do all these other annoying pop-ups, and it'll be like streak, and I'll be like, I don't care, just let me keep studying. Like,
Meanwhile, 90% of their user base goes on exclusively to make streak number go up.
I guess. But like, maybe like warrant or like I don't know, send me a notification later. But if I'm already streaking, stop like reminding me I'm streaking. I
Yeah.
don't know. Like, I don't
Well,
know.
I
Anyway,
think that they figured it out and they sell the feeling of learning a language. They don't sell the actual process of learning a language. And like you said, people don't want to work. So when they feel like they're learning a language, Duolingo can get 1 or 2 years out of them before they realize, oh crap, I haven't really learned anything. This is a waste of time.
hmm, yeah, I think Duolingo is actually not the worst for learning new scripts. So when you're trying to get used, like I actually found I progressed quite a lot in Russian,
Oh,
and
their Cyrillic alphabet course is phenomenal.
yeah, so the Cyrillic was good. Chinese, like I think I made some good progress there that I just probably wouldn't have made otherwise. And the Arabic stuff is like half decent too. I went through quite a bit of it. So I think for learning like new scripts or foreign scripts, Duolingo maybe has a place for a little bit as like training wheels, but for anything Latin language where you can basically read all the characters anyway, certainly French, Spanish, Italian, Portuguese, just completely skip it. Like just completely skip Duolingo. Serves no purpose. You're better off going straight to reading the newspaper and this kind of thing.
Yeah, I like to call it the gateway drug. Um, so Duolingo is the gateway drug of learning another language. Some people will stay with it forever. Some people will quit altogether, and there will be a large majority who move on to something more potent. And
Hmm.
that's when you get into the things that are actually enjoyable, where you will make progress. But if you're establishing a base, if you're setting up like, okay, this is how sentence structure kind of works, because they don't really tell you the rules. If you're like, okay, now I've got 100 words under my belt that I can kind of play with, great. Especially the new scripts, like you said. I really enjoyed their Cyrillic alphabet course. I thought that was really well done. But after that, move on to something more potent.
Hmm. Hmm. Where do you find that most of your clients get like hit maybe a glass ceiling or kind of stop making progress?
I think the ceiling comes actually pretty early on. I think that there's something that a lot of people who are in the language acquisition space talk about called the silent period, and I think that's the glass ceiling. And it doesn't happen initially, interestingly enough, because people are less afraid to speak when they know less,
Hmm.
and then when they think that they almost have it is when they get the most afraid. They're like, okay, this is almost perfect, but it's not perfect, so I'm not going to say it. They know enough to know that they're wrong, whereas the people at the very beginning don't know what they don't know, so they're just going. That's great. It just kind of tapers off as things get better until one day they realize I was making those mistakes month 1 through 3. It doesn't really matter that I'm still making them because I'm better and it's not the same mistakes. So pushing through that 6th month of I know what I don't know to I know what I don't know, but I can get better using that is probably the biggest glass ceiling. 6 months in 6 to 9 months, depending on how much time they have to focus on stuff.
This episode of the My Latin Life podcast is brought to you in part by Job Stacking. Introducing Rolf Haltza's Paycheck Multiplication Layering Method, a revolutionary approach that redefines the traditional career path. This is Rolf's new Done With You program where he'll work with you to implement job stacking for yourself. With this method, Rolf contractually guarantees that you'll be able to double your income in 45 days. So, are you ready to step out of the shadows of job insecurity and step into a world of career abundance? Then just click the link in the description of this episode, book a call with Rolf, and start walking the path of unleashing your earning potential with job stacking. Yeah, there's kind of like a middle trough. Like if you looked at a chart, it would be like initial major gains and excitement, and then it's like very flat for a long time, type of thing.
Yeah.
Like what do you call that? Um,
Plateau.
Plateau, but also diminishing returns. You know.
Yeah, yeah. I I liken it a lot to like bodybuilding, where you get
Mm,
newbie
yep.
gains, you get pumped, and then it's just a slog, and you're maybe adding one or two new concepts per week, and you're maybe having to go back to those the next week because you didn't quite hit your PR, and so you can't move up to the next level yet. And you're just grinding it, grinding it, grinding it until one day you've got it, but your body dysmorphia won't let you think you got it, so you continue indefinitely. And that's, I think, how it kind of goes.
Yeah, it's like I think there's a upside to this too, where you can get conversational in just a couple months, and you can get to uh, B2 on the scale, or like a solid B1 on the scale within like 6 months easily, right? And then it's just like once you hit like you can get to, like up to say call it 80% fluency in less than a year without too much effort. But then that last 20%, will take 5, 10 years.
Yeah, and this is another thing that I talk about a lot. Uh, Most people won't reach that 20% in their native language, let alone in the second language that they're working on. So getting to that 80 is awesome, and pushing beyond that is even better. But you have to keep in mind that a lot of people aren't even going to know what you're talking about if you get too advanced in their own native language. There's countless memes of like, I learn English to make fun of the English speakers who mess it up, kind of thing.
Yeah, perhaps. Would you want to explain the scale for people that are unfamiliar, the A1, A2, uh, that scale?
Yeah, I'll explain it to the best of my understanding. But A1 is very beginner, just starting out. A2 is basic grasp of concepts. You can kind of explain things, but only in the present tense, really. B1, you're reaching into conversational, and you can hold surface level conversations, maybe not with native speakers, at least if they're not speaking clearly. Uh, and from B2, that's where you get over the I can't understand everybody to the I can kind of understand everybody, but I can't express everything that I want to express. However, you're much more adept at explaining things. You may not know the word for everything, but you can find a way to say everything.
Hmm.
Coming back to the hand shoes for gloves, that's B2. C1 is, and B2 is actually what you need to study at university in Germany and Belgium, and I believe France also. So if you have a B2, you can study at any university, which means you're good enough to study at a university, at least in that foreign language. C1 is next to expert level proficiency, fluency, native level, and then C2 is where you get that last 20%. Doctors, lawyers, scientists, all the super technical, uh, and it's particularly in French, you have to know like the 27 grammar tenses, when they are used, how they're used, reading and writing, philosophy type things.
Hmm. And so how does this how is this important to people? So you have like a 6 level scale. How should people be thinking about this scale? Because it is like basically universally used, right?
It's actually not used by the US. As far as I understand it, it's the European scale.
Right. It's a
So it's
European
all,
scale, but maybe it's not like official in the US, but I feel like
everyone goes by it.
even
Yeah.
everyone goes by in like a informal type of way, you know.
Yeah. In the US, it's like a 1 through 5 grading system, which is like native level proficiency, fluent, uh, advanced, intermediate, beginner.
Hmm.
So that's I forget what the name of that scale is, because like you said, nobody uses it, but technically it's our scale. Uh, so it's important for a few different reasons. A lot of countries for visa stuff will have a B1, B2 area requirement for at least for like long term residential stuff. Universities require a B2 level exam in order to study or apply it to the universities. Um, as far as what it means in people's day to day lives, reach for B1 as fast as possible, start having conversations, and then you'll build naturally. Once you can talk to people, it gets a lot easier. Uh, it's much more fun to make mistakes and talk to people than it is to sit alone and write in your room. Um, but let's see. Other than that, unless you're looking to, I think when I was looking at graduate school in Luxembourg, you needed a C1 even, which was intimidating. But other than that, it's more of a how am I tracking my own level type thing,
Hmm.
unless you plan to use it for work or travel.
Yeah. And I would say, I guess for our audience specifically that's interested in residencies and second passports and naturalization, naturalizing in almost any country will involve a language test. And the language test is usually roughly based on this European scale, even if it's in Latin America, where they kind of say like, oh, do you need like A2 or B1 or B2? You don't need like C level language skills to naturalize, usually in any country. But I think Portugal specifically asks for A2 or B1, and same thing with Italy. Italy, I think just this year put in a requirement for non-Italian spouses that if they want to get the Italian citizenship, they have to have A2 or B1 level Italian, and they might even have to get that certified. Kind of depends on the country. Some countries just have like a random exam that they issue themselves. Maybe some countries say you have to go to like a third party company and get like an official exam. So it really kind of depends. Every country kind of does it slightly different, but almost every country, if you want to naturalize either by living there or marrying or whatever, a lot of the times they require a certain level of language proficiency.
Yeah, and I think that's where that's important for anybody who's looking to move abroad or naturalize somewhere else. As far as U.S. bound and people who are staying in the U.S. want to come to the U.S., the CLEP levels are probably more important because it's going to get you out of university classes. Uh, but that's more of a saving money on the university side of things than a language
Mm-hmm.
proficiency
Mm-hmm.
scale necessarily.
Definitely makes sense. Cool. What do you think about italki? And in Spanish, we have Language Blend podcast, sponsor of this podcast. We have Baselang as well. What do you think about these websites where you pay for, for 1 hour one-on-one lessons?
I think that they're excellent. I find it difficult, I guess, as somebody who would potentially be working with somebody on it, I probably wouldn't do it just because it can be a lot of effort. And from what I understand, italki is $15 generally base, um, which is really great for the learner, but for the person teaching, not as great. So if you can get a good tutor on one of those, it's probably one of the better ways to do things because you're speaking to a natural native born speaker in
Mm-hmm.
theory. Um, the inherent danger of it is if you're only talking to that person in Spanish, for example, the likelihood of you only understanding that person's voice increases the more that they're your only audio input. Um, I had that problem when I was living in Costa Rica. I was talking to my host mom for like 3 days before school started, and I could understand her perfectly by day three. Then I went to school and I was like, oh shit, I can't understand anything that anybody's saying to me right now. Uh, but as a general language learning tool, as long as you're diversifying your input, it's great.
It's true. You do need to diversify and get different sources because an old lady is going to speak very different than, five drunk guys around a table.
Yeah, exactly. And I think podcasts are really great for that too because you're going to need slang. Everyone's going to speak to you in slang. So whether you know it or not, you're going to hear it. It's better to know it than not. And if you're watching podcasts and or reality TV, interestingly enough, I think reality TV is a great way to watch how people interact with one another.
Yep.
They get put into crazy situations, but it's still real people speaking how they would speak in those situations, which is always interesting. So, yeah, the listening to the old lady and listening to the drunk dudes is going to be two very different things. And if you're only ever hearing the old lady, you're going to get very confused very quick.
This episode of the My Latin Life podcast is brought to you in part by Bit Refill. Bit Refill is the best way to spend your crypto in Latin America. Purchase gift cards or mobile refills from more than 3,500 brands in 186 countries instantly, safely, and privately. Visit bitrefill.com for more information. So I've had some tweets in the past where I talk about my language learning philosophy, and one thing that I said was all me. But what I would say is there's four pillars of language learning: reading, writing, listening, and speaking. I guess you could agree or disagree with that basic premise, but four pillars: reading, writing, listening, speaking. of which the most important of that four, of those four, is listening by far. And then speaking and reading are probably somewhere around tied, and then writing potentially the least important. So part of the idea here is that you want to maybe overweight listening relative to, say, writing, and not think of it as like dedicating 25% effort to each pillar, but in fact some pillars are more important than others, of which speaking and listening are probably the most important.
I would probably disagree with that.
That's
I
fine,
think
do it.
lists. So here's my theory on that. I agree with your four pillars, except for I'd add a fifth, and that's translation. Um, and I think that the importance of the pillars actually is dynamic. So when you're starting out, listening is going to be probably the most important because it's going to be the thing that you can is the easiest for you to do.
Mm-hmm.
And I think as far as the time you're actually putting in, listening is going to be the most intensive. You're going to listen more than anything else. But I don't think that that necessarily means it's going to be like dedicated study time. You might be just listening to a song or listening to a movie or listening to an audiobook.
Mm-hmm.
And you don't really have to sit down and pay attention when you're doing that. And you can still get words like, oh, I heard a new word today, or oh, I got that. I finally understood what that sentence was, things like that. But I really think that the core of speaking, especially like a native speaker, is thinking in that language. And it's going to be nearly impossible for you to learn how to think in the language if you're not creating with that language. And you're not really creating anything when you're listening. So
Mm-hmm.
while you will listen the most, the more that you
It's
create.
passive, you're saying.
Yeah,
But there's
exactly.
active and passive listening.
I agree. I think one of the best things that someone can do is listen to something with. So all of the songs that I have in this playlist, they have the lyrics because if you can make the sound connection, it makes it easier to hear individual words when somebody's speaking and you're not looking at what they're saying.
Mm-hmm.
So reading along with an audiobook, I think, is a fantastic way to approach things. But I also think you have to be, if you're doing that, you're probably going to be writing also. Writing down things that you're picking out, writing down new words, writing down contexts. I use reverso.com instead of Google Translate because it'll give you potential translations for whatever you're looking for, but it'll also give them in contexts. So you can see how different words are
Reverso?
synonym. Yeah, reverso.com.
Reverso.com.
Yeah, just translate a word and see what comes up. It's really cool.
And
It'll.
would it understand like Mexican slang? I'm opening it.
Oh, I have not tried slang with it. Let's see.
Vamos a chingar unas chelas. No, it did not get that at all.
Yeah, it definitely changed Penocha to Peroa.
It didn't know that chela is a beer. Anyway,
Yeah, I've never tried slang with it, but
so anyway, but this might bit of a digression there, but one thing I noticed in my journey when I learned my first foreign language was that I could speak pretty well because I was like doing the Benny Lewis thing, and it was like speak, 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 and I was like, cool, yeah, like je veux aller au restaurant, you know what I mean? And so I could say like full phrases pretty well, good accent, good grammar. So I thought I was doing all right. I thought my level of French was pretty all right. I could say like full sentences, multiple full sentences, pretty much say anything I wanted to communicate. But then I would get in a group setting and I couldn't understand anything people were saying. Like literally less than 20%. And I was like, what the hell is going on here? And the big thing was I just was not listening enough. I didn't have Netflix at that point in time. I wasn't really like watching movies. Um, I was listening to a little bit of music, but like a fair bit of music, but that was kind of like one of my only audio inputs was like French music. And that's not the best for it's okay, but that won't really help you understand a dynamic conversation where people are going back and forth, you know what I mean? And like being and dropping zingers at each other and stuff like that. So I realized I wasn't listening enough. And so I really kind of flipped my thing to my learning strategy to really go hard on listening and understanding the uh, the the spoken aspects of the local dialect. Whereas, for example, in French, they mush words together a lot.
Shui,
Like, yeah, je suis becomes suis, and like
Shippa.
that's yeah, je sais pas, je ne sais pas. Even an English speaker probably knows that means like I don't know. But in French, it become like je sais pas, and like in Quebec, they'll make it even more insane. They'll be like je sais pas. Um, oh, je suis can become chou in Quebec.
Yeah, that's
So
why
you
it's
could
hard
say
to
like I'm
understand.
not. So you'd be like I'm not down. In French, you could be like je ne suis pas down or je suis pas down, je suis pas down. And in Quebec, you'd be like je suis pas down, and it becomes more of like a shoe sound. It's weird. Like and people even write it chu. Um,
Huh.
yeah, it's pretty insane. And so I just explained like five, six versions of like the same thing, and to like to hear that is a challenge, especially to someone that has no one to like explain to them like some of these things, right? So anyway, so long story short, I think listening is by far the most important thing, and I think I might have related this story to Miguel on our previous podcast where we were talking about language learning. I had a tweet about this a while back, like months ago, deep in the archives, but there's this famous scene in Ocean's 11, okay? And they're like they're all huddled around the blueprints and they're like trying to figure out how to crack into the safe and get past the lasers, you know, and it's like Matt Damon and Brad Pitt and there's a Chinese guy and Don Cheadle and right and they're all like making the plan and you know someone goes like, "Yeah, like what do we do about the motion sensors?" And then the Chinese guy pops out speaking Chinese, and he's like, "Ha wah 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 wah," like in Chinese. And then Matt Damon is like, "You're right. We are gonna have to deal with the moisture or something like that, right?" And so I would argue Matt Damon is fluent in Chinese because he could understand Chinese when he heard it. He had perfect listening skills. And whether or not Matt Damon could respond in Chinese, it would be much less important. You know what I mean? Even if he could only respond yes or no in Chinese, that would be good enough, right? So, like, as a mental experiment, if you could understand Chinese 100% perfectly, everything people were saying, and you could only respond yes or no, I would consider you fluent in Chinese. But if you could speak 100% perfect Chinese, but had no idea what people are saying at you in response, I would say that person is not fluent in Chinese. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think it would depend where you're at. If you're in China, being able to understand everything and to not respond gets frustrating. And if you're in the US, being able to speak and not understand doesn't really matter because you got the job anyway,
I don't know though. I've heard this
right?
argument, so I would push back on this because if you're in China and people kind of realize, oh, he understands everything, but he just can only say yes or no, people will just adapt and then phrase everything to you as like a yes or no question, and you'll be able to get by totally fine, right?
I don't know. You
Whereas
have a lot more faith in people than I do.
Whereas the other side of that equation would be like you could speak perfectly and then like be like, "Hey, I can't understand anything you say except yes or no." I mean, I guess that could kind of work too. But all else being equal, I think you'd be much better off being able to listen.
Yeah, I think if you had to pick one or the other, um, then listening is probably more important if it's the only thing that you're going to do. Uh, the reason that I harp so much on writing is because people will not do it. So if
Yeah,
me bitching about you not writing gets you to do it 1 hour per week, then I consider that a win.
I think writing for most people will basically just be WhatsApp, and no one's really going to be doing too much emailing. No one's going to be writing blog articles in a foreign language. It's really just WhatsApp. So, you'll get that from dating, you'll get that from coordinating soccer games and pick up basketball in a foreign country. And that's fine. And a lot of that, you'll learn a lot just like copy pasting Google Translate into your conversation. Like someone will be like, "Hey, like vamos a jugar, let's play basketball tonight, 8 p.m." Then you like copy what they say into Google Translate. Then you paste back like, "Yeah, I can play. I'll be late." Blah blah blah. So I think that will be kind of like natural as you're making friends from these countries. Um, but yeah, any of the so of the four pillars, reading, writing, speaking, listening, I would say listening is by far the most important. And especially in like a bilingual setting, right? Where let's just say you have buddies that you're like, you're five guys drinking beer, you're in Barcelona, everyone can kind of speak English pretty well. So if you're just drinking beer with a bunch of guys and they're all speaking Spanish and you understand what they're saying, but you respond in English or like Spanglish, like that's totally legit. But if you couldn't understand what people were saying while you're drinking beers, even if you can say vamos al bar, like it's like irrelevant. You know what I mean? Like you're not a leader anymore. You're not really able to like participate in the same way. You know what I mean? So,
I, I also think listening is the easiest pillar. I think it's the easiest hump to get over. There's a lot of people who end their entire journey with, well, I can understand it, but I can't speak it.
and that's fine. Like I would consider that person fluent. You know what I mean? If someone said like because I know a lot of people like that. You probably do too. Growing up in the states where you grew up, like people who are like third generation Mexican or whatever,
Yeah,
the no sabo kids as they call them, and they can like understand Spanish, but they just can't speak it very well. I still say that's like a great skill to have, and if I was one of those people, I would rather they can listen to their abuela versus like say a bunch of stuff, but then not know what their abuela is saying.
I don't know. I think speaking to the abuela in their mother tongue is one of the best things you can do for your heritage.
All right. Well, definitely a debate to last the ages, the never-ending debate over listening versus speaking and this kind of thing. But dude, really been a fun conversation talking about language learning strategies. And I think probably the most important thing about what you do is that you make it seem relatable and possible for people that it's possible to learn multiple languages. And I think just overcoming that mental barrier, that limiting belief, and believing it's possible is the most important piece. So I salute what you do for sure.
I appreciate it. Yeah, and that's one of the things that I try to hammer home too is like if I can do it, anybody can do it because I'm not like oh, you speak so many languages, you must be so smart. I'm like, give me a calculator for basic math. So,
Everybody's got their thing.
I really appreciate you having me on, man. This was a good conversation.
Yeah, definitely. We're definitely wrapping up, but I just wanted to put in this one more thing that kind of speaking to my point, which I think is kind of funny, is like when I first started learning languages and I would, learn simple nouns to be like, okay, cat is gato, or, dog is chien, right? And part of my brain was like, yeah, I know in Spanish it's gato, but that's not the real word. The real word is cat. The real word is cat, but the Spanish word is gato. But then once you start seeing it like being used actively and you see and you meet people that they only know this animal as a gato, it really starts to like enforce the idea that you're not just translating English, that it really is something that like stands on its own, if that makes sense. But
It makes so much sense. When I moved to Costa Rica, my host mom told me the Wi-Fi password is Luna Negra 2000 because their dog was named Luna and she was black. And I went in and I typed in the password box Black Moon 2000 because I just didn't it didn't click. And then you're right. Once you start realizing, oh, this is how they communicate. It's not connected to English at all. It's completely separate. And that's why I harp on getting to think in that language, which is the
mm-hmm,
hardest barrier.
mm-hmm. There you go.
Oh, one last thing
Go for
before
it.
the actual age old debate. What's more important, vocabulary or grammar? Starting out, I should say. First
Okay.
3 months, vocabulary or grammar?
First 3 months, definitely vocabulary.
Thank you. Yeah, okay, well, that's all.
Like I said, vocab first and then tighten up the grammar later.
Yep, build a base, then refine.
Grammar first. What are you even conjugating? You don't know the words yet.
Yeah, I know. I argue with some German girl online on Twitter a lot about. She's like, I love my grammar textbooks. I'm like, yeah, you and the 6 other people who bought them.
Very German response. Anyway, all right. So let's get to wrapping up. My good sir, Bowtied Odin, hit us with your shout outs, your final message to the audience, where they can find you, all that good stuff.
All right. Well, thank you again for having me on. This was awesome. Twitter, BowTiedOdin, TikTok, Instagram, all the same. YouTube, we just passed 200 subscribers, which is exciting. So BowTiedOdin's second language strategies, and then always at the website, secondlanguagestrategies.com.
Love it. Keep going on YouTube, man. I think that'll do well.
Yeah, it's going to be big. We're just getting started.
Well, thanks again for doing this, Bowtied Odin. Um, what Odin, by the way, is like a Greek god or something? Remind me.
Norse god. So Norse
Norse god.
god
And
who
was he a
united
polyglot?
he united all the realms. So that was kind of my idea, was uniting people through language.
Okay, a little Tower of Babel type of vibe. Got it.
Yeah.
Got it. There we go. Now you guys know the origin to Bowtied Odin. You can find them everywhere. Links will be in the bio. And audience, quick call to action before you go as well. Please be sure to like and subscribe to the My Latin Life podcast wherever you're at. Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube. Helps us grow the channel. We put out 2 episodes a week. You don't want to miss anything. But with that, thank you to Bowtied Odin, and thank you to the audience for listening. Cheers.